I am very pleased today that we have a special guest. Our first interview segment is with Mary B. Robinson, the theater director and a longtime member of the Philadelphia theater community, even though you live in Brooklyn, am I right?
That's right.
But you grew up in the Philadelphia area. Where did you spend your childhood?
Well, first in media when I was really little. And then after 2 years where my father worked in Washington, D.C. in the early 60s, we came back and lived in Haverford, which is where I did my main growing up. So when I was in media, we saw children's theater at the Hedgerow. And after we came back, I remember seeing something at the Theater for the Living Arts. We certainly saw, tours that came through Philly on their way to or from New York.
Uh-huh.
And then I think the theater experience I remember best as being really transforming was the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company that does, Gilbert and Sullivan, came through Philadelphia on an American
tour. This was the British company, not the Savoy
British
company.
Yes,
right. Okay.
That's right. Yes, the British company in 1964, and I saw Pirates of Penzance at the Academy of Music at the age of 10 or 11, and was just, as I said, just really transported by it. And actually, after that kind of got me and my whole family hooked on Gilbert and Sullivan. So we went to all the Savoy productions at Longwood Gardens. We went to the Plays and Players, G&S Players, I think they were called, in Philly. And, that kind of, led to a lifelong love of Gilbert and Sullivan and really started me off on a lifelong theater love. I mean, the reason I did see all this theater is my mother was a theater aficionado, very passionate about it, a theater goer. And she would take us to things. She would we would make an annual family trip to New York, for heaven's sakes, to see theater. We saw some really interesting stuff. We saw, stuff on Broadway. I remember seeing Julie Harris and 40 Carats and Pearl Bailey and Hello Dolly. We also saw To Be Young, Gifted, and Black at the Cherry Lane Theater in the late 60s. My mother really loved the work of Lorraine Hansberry and thought we would be, intrigued by it, and we were. And Man in the Moon Marigolds, she really found things off the beaten path, both in Philly and in New York for us to see.
Interesting. So a lot of Philadelphia people got in the habit of going to New York or waiting to see New York productions come to Philadelphia. That was a standard Philadelphia theater goer attitude at the time in the 60s, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there was a lot of theater. It was tryout theater and then, the tours that probably went to all the cities. But Philadelphia was one of the main stops, I think.
By the time you went to the Baldwin School, as I recall?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Was there a theater program there? Do you remember doing shows?
It was much more important to me than my college theater program, as a matter of fact. It was huge. It was probably every bit as important as the theater going I was doing, was the fact that from the age of 10 on, I came into the orbit of this amazing woman named Lois Goutman, who was the drama department at Baldwin and did very ambitious plays, which at the time thought, oh, well, we're doing The Tempest, or we're doing, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or Skin of Our Teeth, or a Beckett play, for heaven's sakes. And now I think that's amazing that we did those plays and we're so comfortable with them. And she was so convinced that we could pull them off. So that was a huge, huge aspect of my growing up. And, I not only was in the plays, but painted the scenery and stage managed and got props. And, we all of us did everything. And it was was
it all female version? Or was it?
Yes, it was. So, of course, I played. So, of course, being 5'10", I played the guys' roles.
Right.
Until my senior year when we did Blythe Spirit and I got to play a woman for the first. But of course, playing the men's roles, I played some great roles because most plays have, most classic plays have lots and lots of men's roles and a few women's roles.
You were acting. You were performing then.
Yes, exactly.
But then you went on to Smith. Am I right?
Yes,
College?
That's right. Yes. Uh-huh.
And you say that was less important. Why?
Well, it was a difficult time. It was It was competitive. It wasn't the kind of community. This is, again, no fault of the theater program, maybe just the vibes there. I had such a strong sense of community at Baldwin, the people who did theater. At Smith, there was some competition. It was also, they had a graduate acting program.
Did they?
Where they had all men. And it made sense because then those men would play, the roles that, so then I got to play women, but I never thought I would go on to have a professional career as an actor, being 5'10", I was playing the mother's roles at Smith, right? So, and then I began directing, partly because I played Gertrude in Hamlet at Amherst. The really good actor is Hamlet. Jeffrey Wade, his name is. We're still in touch. He's, worked out as an actor in the West Coast for years. And I was really bad. I really wasn't good. And it was the first time as an actor I had come up against my own limitations in a really sobering way. And so I began to direct just to kind of learn more about what I felt the director of that production had not helped me with, because I went to him a number of times and he was just kind of dismissive. And I thought, well, what should a director have said to me? So I began directing, and I immediately thought, oh, this is the right fit. This is what I, maybe could even do professionally. And so the last 2 years I was at Smith, I still acted, but directing was my focus. And I really, really worked to learn. The first show I directed was a, Chekhov one act, which was kind of delightful. Then I worked on Ibsen's Ghosts, which was really hard.
Yes.
But I also actually directed Gilbert and Sullivan. I directed a Gilbert and Sullivan production at Princess Ida at Mount Holyoke and Redagore at Smith.
So as you're leaving college, then what's your next step? You decide to go pursue this professionally?
Yes. I wanted to. I thought I could try to pursue directing professionally. I didn't know how to go about it. I also didn't know what the long-term aspect of it would be, because I thought I don't want to be itinerant for the rest of my life. I know at some point I knew I would probably like to have a family and settle down. So in March of 1975, which was my senior year, the theater department had a panel discussion called Regional Theater. What is it, and is it for you? And it was, some real luminaries, several artistic directors, including Zelda Fichandler from the Arena Stage at Washington. And I knew about her because for 2 years, from 61 to 63, we actually lived in the DC area. And my parents were subscribers to the Arena Stage. In fact, I've still got the programs my mother saved. I've been looking them over lately. And there were other people speaking there too, but she was just completely inspiring. She was about 50 at the time, about the same age as my mother. And and she talked about running a theater. I knew she had children who were about my age. Her husband was the managing director of the theater. And I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. This is it. There you go. So for 15 years, I went out into the world and, directed where I could and sort of did all sorts of things, but always my goal was to be the artistic director of a regional theater.
So, but you got an early start at Hartford Stage, not far away from there. Was that right out of college, or
No, I was 5 years out of college. It was a very long 5 years. I delayed going to New York for a year. I worked in regional theaters as director's assistants and so forth, and had survival jobs. And then I went to New York. I thought, if I want to get a job at a regional theater as a director or on the artistic staff, I've got to build some credits, and the place to do that is in New York, because there was so much going on in the off-Broadway movement at the time. A lot of new theaters like Manhattan Theater Club, Playwrights Horizons, Circle Rep, Ensemble Studio Theater. So I moved to New York 1 year out of college and read scripts, sometimes at first for free while I had a survival job. And then I actually made a living reading scripts. I was paid $5 a script and I read 30 a week or something. Wow. So, and then from there, at the age of 26, I went to the Hartford Stage, because my marketable skill then was new plays and knowing playwrights, and I was hired as their literary manager.
Did you go back to New York after that was over? Or?
Yeah, I did. I was back in New York a fair amount anyway. I mean, it was an amazingly flexible job, and Mark, let me come and go. I directed several plays. I directed a play at the Early Vineyard Theater. I directed the first regional theater I did, which was out of South Coast Rep, other than Hartford, I should say. Out of South Coast Rep in California. I did while I was still technically at Hartford. So it was and after a few years, I stopped being literary manager and just was associate artistic director. So I didn't have to deal with all the scripts. I was just basically on the artistic staff and free to kind of come and go. So right. I directed about 4 or 5 plays there. And didn't realize it at the time, but that was I did realize it probably. But anyway, Hartford was a really great place to be, not just in terms of the exciting work that was being done, but people were looking at it. And so people saw my work as a result of the work I did at Hartford and New York too at the time.
What was your sense of the larger trend in American theater? Based at that time in your life, were you generally feeling that American theater, and particularly the nonprofit regional theater like Hartford, was heading in a healthy direction? Did you sense like this is good, but not as good as it could be? What was your sort of?
No, I mean, Mark, if anything, was such an artist to the point where he was almost dismissive of some of the other aspects of the job, audience development and, marketing and, community relations and those things. But what he really instilled in me was the fact that an artistic director is not just a producer of entertainment, but an artist, even if that person doesn't direct. But of course, when that person does direct, as Mark did and as I did and do, Mark does still, he's now the artistic director of the Westport Country Playhouse in Connecticut. The entire institution this is a Zelda Chandler quote, is a work of art. And so I would go to Theater Communications Group conferences, and I certainly saw that a lot of theaters were struggling to survive and doing, or thought they were struggling to survive. I don't know. I mean, but for whatever reason, they were doing crowd-pleasing work in order to, keep going, get those subscription numbers up, really, have the size staff they wanted. And Mark basically said, that's not my focus. My focus is the work itself and doing the most exciting work we possibly can, fueled by the artists who do it. And the managing director and her staff, figure out that part of it. So that was kind of my template. And when I left Hartford, and with Mark, they certainly lost a number of audience members. So I basically, left Hartford in 1985 thinking, well, that's what I want to do eventually, is run a theater like Hartford. I should say Mark did lose a number of audience members, and then he got new audience members drawn to the kind of work he was doing. And that's kind of what happened in theaters around the country, I would say, in those years.
But in those years, what was also happening was that most of the regional theaters, who often have been built on a repertory model, that was the R, right?
Yeah.
I tell my students, R was not for regional, R was for repertory, which implies a company. Most of the companies were discarding their regular company members if they never had them. Yeah. Did that discourage you or encourage you, or did you say, well, that's the way things is?
Well, I always wanted to have an acting company. That just seemed to me, and they too have been based on what Zelda Chandler was doing in Washington. I thought the fact that she had a company of actors who could have a life, just for the same reason that I wanted to run a resident, she used to call them resident theaters, resident regional repertory is what she would always say, that they could be in residence as well, as could designers, as could, all the theater artists. They used to have resident playwrights at Arena. We talked about that at Hartford. I brought it up consistently because I was so passionately in favor of it. Mark Lamos had actually come from a company because he started out at the Guthrie as an actor at the Guthrie. And so he knew all the benefits of a company, but he also felt there were limitations, and the limitations had to do with casting new plays. And Arena, by the way, never had been very well known for their new play production, because a repertory company is a wonderful idea when you're doing Shakespeare and Chekhov and so forth. But we were only doing 5 plays a year at Hartford, and at least one of them was a new play. And it was hard on a writer to say, this was the case Mark would make, to say, we're doing your play, but you have to cast it out of this company. In fact, we would sometimes do readings and cast them out of the company that was currently in whatever production. And the playwrights would say, you didn't hear it read with an actor who was right for the role.
Right. So most of the prominent American regional theaters, like the Alley, the Dallas Theater Center, the Milwaukee Rep, Arena Stage, as we've mentioned, had been founded or were being sometimes run by dynamic female artistic directors. Did you feel that the question of leadership by women in regional theaters was already a settled question, or did you feel there was still a bit of a bar towards being considered as a leader of a regional company?
Well, by the time I was old enough to lead a company, I don't believe it was a bar. While certainly women were sort of at the forefront of this movement in the 40s and 50s, there were, Irene Lewis was a role model for me. Right. She was their associate director at Hartford Stage before I came, and she actually ran the Philadelphia Drama Guild for a year, 80 to 81. Right. But there was certainly a bar to directing. I did find at first there was a woman director, really? And I thought, are you kidding me? I'd been to Baldwin and I'd been to Smith and, all women. So that gradually diminished, partly because there were so many of us that came on the scene around 75. There was Sharon Ott, Emily Mann, Pam Berlin, myself. The older directors, slightly older directors like Amy Saltz and Irene Lewis had a tougher time of it than we did. And so right around the time I was ready to run a theater, which was in the late 80s, around 1990, I felt that the theaters that I interviewed for, they were absolutely open to a woman coming into lead.
So you had in mind that you would like to be running a theater company. That was a career goal. You at that point had a major success in New York, the Shana Madel. How did that project come your way?
It sort of piggybacked onto a project I did right out of Hartford Stage called Lemon Sky, which is a play by very early play by Lamford Wilson, which I had read and loved. And talked with him about when he was up doing Three Sisters in, I guess it was the spring of 84. I was just out of Hartford, kind of wondering how I was going to, support myself and where I was going to work, and had pitched Lemon Sky to a bunch of different theaters. And Second Stage decided to do it, and Lamford said he wanted me to direct it. And so that was huge because that was very, that was a kind of a big deal because it was Lamford Wilson. And so a lot of offers, both regionally and in New York, came out of that. And one of them was a Shana Madel, which, they approached me about. I mean, in those years, I sort of didn't have to look for work for a few years. It kind of came my way. So I was, I interviewed with the playwright and, we hit it off, and they asked me to do the off-Broadway production of it, which is the first and only commercial production I've ever done.
But how was that different, the production?
It was hard. I didn't like the approach of, the whole goal here is to make money, and if we do a good piece of work at the same time, good for us, as opposed to the whole goal is to make a really good piece of work and not lose a lot of money because we're a nonprofit theater, but we can't, go too far into the red, which was what I'd grown up on. Producers would say, okay, what stars can we get in? And, present me with a list of stars who were completely wrong for the roles. I thought, this is ridiculous. I can't get behind this, but, I also don't want the show to close and everybody lose their work. It was a beautiful play, and I feel very proud of the production when it initially opened. And some very good people went into it. Amy Ryan, it was her very first play at the age of 19 that she did. But, but overall, it was challenging.
But just at that time, we're now up to about 1990, and we're finally going to get Philadelphia back into the story again, which is our purpose here. You are hired by the Philadelphia Drama Guild, which was at that point a well-established, although only been professional theater company for about 10 years. It had been, just to catch everybody up who's not up on it, it had been started by Sid Bloom, former Philadelphia dentist, as an amateur company, and it moved into the then newly renovated Walnut Street Theater in 1970 as a professional company, and was the resident company there for 10 years, after which point it moved out and it was taken over by I'm forgetting about Poggi.
It was first taken over by Irene Lewis.
Oh, Irene. No, you're right.
Yes.
You're right. Well, it was run by Doug Seal, right?
Yeah, Doug Seal, still in the Walnut, and then when it went to Annenberg, Irene Lewis was artistic director for a year, and then she left. Right. And Greg Poggi, who was the managing director, took over as artistic director. Right. Yes.
So he was Gregory. But he was a managing director type. He wasn't. That's right. He wasn't a theater director. So, and that's happened at other institutions. That wasn't exceptional. I've heard of that happen other places where it's run by the business side, essentially. Right. But it had some success at the Walnut, but then, for various reasons, had moved out. I'll cover that elsewhere in the podcast. Okay. And it's continued as the subscription-based model at the Zellerbach Theater. So now this newly built modern theater, a thrust stage at the Annenberg Center at the campus in the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. So a completely different locale. But it had been able mostly to maintain its subscription base at that point. But it was now looking for a new direction. And so did they approach you? Did they find you, or was there a search going on?
There was a search, and the search, the headhunter was somebody that I knew from Theater Communications Group conferences, and he'd actually approached me about a few other jobs. And this one just felt really right to me because it was so close. It was an hour and a half from where we were living in New York. I was newly married by then and did not want to sort of uproot our lives too much and go too far afield. That was important too. Also, it was in a community I'd grown up in. And so he contacted me, and then I started interviewing with the search committee and eventually the whole board in the fall of 1989.
Okay. So by 1990, though, they announced that you were going to be the new artistic director. I've looked at the newspaper archives. I've seen the articles and all the background to that. And you were married by then to the playwright Eric Brogger, right?
Yes, Brogger, yes.
And you had met him where?
So we met in 1982 at a playwrights conference in Chicago that we were both in. I was working on his play as a dramaturg. He was wonderful. It was and is a wonderful playwright. But he was then teaching at Arizona, and I was in Hartford. So once we both moved back to New York, as it happened in 1985, we began dating, and then we're married in 88. So as
looking for something where both of you could go and where you could both find a bit of a home there?
Well, I don't know that we were necessarily thinking that he would, he would live full time in Philly, because he was teaching at Hofstra University on Long Island as an adjunct. And right at the same time I got the job offer to go to Philly, he was offered a full-time job at Hofstra. So we had a split existence. We had a large apartment in Philly, and he kept his studio in the Village. And, he would Tuesday morning, he would leave Philly and go teach for a few days and come back Thursday evening. So that's
something that hasn't been, I didn't see covered anywhere in the newspaper archives. That's just a question of your personal life that you have to manage when you're a theater professional.
Well, you didn't see it because, of course, I wasn't talking about it. I very much didn't want, it was sometimes challenging, but Eric was great and we made it work until we had a child at the end of 1992, and it became way more difficult. And I'll just say something, because I do want to talk about the personal aspect, because it's, all these years later, I think especially we're sort of, women are kind of coming forth a little more with, the challenges they faced. I actually did not take the job once they offered it to me until I had talked with the head of the search committee about the fact that we were trying to have a child. And I said, and we're not going to stop trying. So I just have to warn you, I could get pregnant at any time. And apparently I talked to the headhunter first and said, he said, you don't need to tell him that. I said, I don't need to, but I want to. I don't. So what is he going to say? No, of course not, but I thought and he was apparently kind of embarrassed by this information, but I think they'd figured it out. They knew I was newly married. I was in my mid 30s, So lucky for the Drama Guild, I had 2.5 years there before I gave birth, but life became much more difficult because then I was a single mom for several nights a week. So, but it was, we worked it out the way people did then and do now.
Right. Well, that is a very interesting side of things, which I would like to return to when we talk about how the overall story of your tenure at the Drama Guild went. Yeah. But again, it's something I did not see much covered in any of the newspaper archive that I have been through. You mentioned right at the start, I did see in the newspaper interviews that you said you weren't going to have a resident company. And we've talked about why you felt that was a choice that you might want to make. But I'd like to hear your memories about the projects that you worked on the Drama Guild, the plays that you produced. So you're installed as the artistic director. Where was your office? Where were you working out of?
Well, we had offices not at the Annenberg Center, but on Arch Street, between I think 17th and 8th Street, 18th. Yeah, they're just sort of Center City, not too far from the Franklin Institute and so forth. But but felt like offices. Did not feel connected with the theater. To get to the theater, we'd have to get on public transportation or whatever and get out to the Annenberg. So we were all back and forth a lot.
Wow. So was there an idea that said, we're here now, but we want to move to another place eventually? Was that always in there?
Absolutely. And it was part of the discussions when I interviewed for the job. There was even already in the late 80s talk of the Avenue of the Arts and a sense that, what are the performing arts organizations that could find a home there. And because the Drama Guild didn't have its own space, but rented out at the Annenberg, we were sort of the prime suspects for it. And the idea of actually being in on the ground floor of creating and us all raising money for and then building a theater was a huge draw. And the Annenberg Center, the Zellerbach Theater, which was a big theater, not a thrust stage actually at the time. It was a proscenium that could become a thrust, and we turned it into a thrust. We said, we've got to have it. It's so hard to make a connection between actors and audience, and a thrust will help. And I was never crazy about the Zellerbach space, but I knew that we were going to be in it for a few years and, really establish ourselves with a certain kind of work and then take that to the avenue of the arts,
What challenges did it have besides it needing to be converted to a thrust?
Well, it certainly had acoustical challenges. It was a very wide, almost 1,000-seat theater. And even as a thrust, it was very, very wide. In fact, Zelda Fitchandler saw a production I did of Othello there and said she liked the work. She said, but the theater is so wide that the energy sort of drains off to the sides. And she said the audience isn't having the experience they should have, even though they may not be aware of what's causing that. She was absolutely convinced that the space was a problem. And my feeling was, well, the space is a problem if we decide it's a problem, but maybe we can schedule work that really belongs in the space, like Shakespeare, which always did well there, August Wilson, a play like Moon for the Misbegotten, which is a small cast play, but very powerful and really held the stage. So it was a matter of doing work that would connect with the audience in that big sort of cavernous space.
Right. There wasn't a separate studio space for you to do smaller productions in?
No. Carol Rockamora's Philadelphia Festival for New Plays, Theater for New Plays, was in the smaller space in the Zellerbach. We did in our final year there produce both in the Zellerbach and at a theater nearby, which was a smaller space. And I loved that. But there is also some speculation that could be one reason people didn't resubscribe, because they didn't want to go to that space.
Right.
So that's, who knows?
Well, let's talk specifically about things that you programmed and that you worked on. I'm selecting just some of the many plays you directed there. But one of your early productions was Busmann and Lena by Athol Fugard. Why did you choose that production early on?
Well, I felt it was a play that could really hold that big space, because it's a small play with 3 characters, but it's about large things. It's about homelessness and male-female relationships. It's sizable in its impact. I think a lot of people felt it was maybe not the right play to open with, but I was going to do a Shakespeare play, Midsummer Night's Dream, later, and I did not feel I had time to prepare it because I was off doing fulfilling other directing commitments until August of the year I arrived there. So it was, but I think maybe I loved working on it. I worked on it with Sorette Scott, who played Lena, terrific actor who now directs a lot, and a wonderful human being. I think some people were really moved by it, and some people just went, I couldn't get the accents, I couldn't connect to it, I didn't feel, why is she doing this? And even some people on the board said, this was really powerful, but I don't know about its being in the very first slot of your first season.
Oh, well.
Oh, and one other thing I'll just say, the Wilma had a reputation for doing Fugard. And there was a little bit of questioning, well, why is she doing this? This isn't what the Drama Guild does. And I so resisted that. I thought, no, you can't define us like that. I really love this play and want to produce and direct it. And
your mindset still is, I'm looking at this artistically. This is where I am wanting to go as an artist. I want to explore this work.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I'm inviting you to come along with me and
that's
the
right.
vision. That's right. That's who you hired.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
But you also you brought in your husband's play, A Novel Life, which is about as I understand, I have not seen it. So it's about a Jewish American family. Am I right about that?
That's right. It's actually called A Normal Life.
Forgive me, I wrote that down.
That's okay. No, that's okay. And it was, we had done it at Seattle the previous summer. That's what I was busy doing and I wanted to, it was adapted from short stories by Delmore Schwartz. It was a beautiful, tender, funny family play, which did wonderfully in Seattle, and which I really wanted to do a new play in my first season. And I read a lot of plays and didn't like any of them as much as this. And so I finally said to the board, look, do you think that I shouldn't do this because I'm married to the playwright? And they said, no, if you feel this is a play that, belongs in the space and that you really want to do, go for it. So I did. It actually worked really well on the Zellerbach stage. And it was a lovely rehearsal period, both in Seattle and in Philly. The problem with that was we opened the night that the first Gulf War started. And literally people were walking into the theater listening to radios. And I had to make a curtain speech. We knew the bombs were about to fall. I mean, everybody's mind was on that. And so that was tough. And, that kind of colored the run for us. But a lot of people did write me and say how much they really enjoyed it. And I always felt very proud of the fact that we did it. It was just the timing was weird.
Yeah. But so you go on to do a number of Shakespeare's, including Othello and Midsummer Night's Dream. But I want to talk about a production of Macbeth you did. And you cast Andre Braugher, who was then recently out of Juilliard. But I was not aware that he'd come down here to do Macbeth rather early in his career. Talk about that. Why you really wanted him in there and what you wanted to do with that production.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of hot on the heels of the Midsummer Night's Dream that I did. And as I said, maybe I did another Shakespeare too soon afterwards, because you really do need time to let that, those plays sit with you. Andre's then girlfriend, now wife, Amy Brabson, was in Midsummer. So he had come to Midsummer. I auditioned him and, many other actors for Macbeth, and just thought he was absolutely terrific. I believe he was only 29 at the time. He was very young, but he just had an authority and a charisma and a command of the stage and the language and the role. And so it was, what we then called colorblind casting. I think people have long since realized there is no such thing, and it was, and so it was an interesting, a good friend of mine said, Clarence Thomas was having his, hearings at the time, and somebody said it made her think of that. And it was like, everybody sort of brought to it what they wanted to. But my point was, the reason of casting him was that I thought he was by far the most exciting actor in the role.
But this was before he had a large reputation in television, before he began appearing in TV shows. Yeah. Do you think that if you had brought him in post his television success, there would have been a different reaction in Philadelphia?
Well, to be honest, I didn't do a great job of that play. I will just be, it's one of the best Shakespeare plays to read, but it's a really hard one to do. And I've often seen not very good productions of Beth, which I kind of learned the hard way that, I didn't have enough time. We never had enough rehearsal time. I think we made some design decisions. I worked with great teams, so it was nothing against any of the actors or the designers. I think I did not run the ship as well as I ran the Midsummer Night's Dream and Othello ship. I actually did Macbeth at Juilliard a few years ago, and Andre and Amy's son was there. And I said to him, he wasn't in it. He was a little older, but he saw it and said to me how much he'd enjoyed it. And I really thought I did a good job with that one, with no budget whatsoever, just people in the room. I said, the last time I directed this was 27 years ago, and both your parents were in it.
but I figured it out now.
Yes, exactly. Yes, right.
You also programmed 2 one-act plays by Nietzsche Sanchez Scott, who is a playwright whose work I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
But she's a as we would say now, Latinx a playwright, but that wasn't a term that was in vogue back then. Why did you want to bring her work to the Drama Guild?
Well, I had worked with her at the Sundance Institute in Utah in 1986. I was invited out there to work on a play, and I immediately said yes, not even having read the play. 2 weeks from the mountains of Utah, what could be better? The play was, and not this one, but another one by Milcha. And it was just this beautiful play that we loved working together. So, she was one of the writers I really wanted to bring. These were not new plays, but she came and, worked with us on them. And it was just a totally different voice that nobody in Philly knew. And we had, a wonderful design team. Alan Moyer was where I was working with a lot of the time, did this amazing thing with this play, The Cuban Swimmer, which was one of the 2 plays where there was this boat 8 feet up in the air and a swimmer 8 feet up in the air near him on a platform, and just an amazing sort of coup de théâtre, which we pulled off. And magic realism is the vein she wrote and writes in. So again, I don't know that they attracted huge audiences, but I felt very proud to have done them.
And you then 3 other plays that I've written down here, which are more recognizable and standard. Misanthrope by Molière, a classic French, serious sort of moral comedy. You do Dancing at Lunasa, which is the great Brian Friel play, which was a big hit on Broadway, and you think would have a lot of, attract a lot of interest. If anyone who was interested in Irish theater, they're interested in that. And then American classic of Mice and Men. So, but by that time, were you dealing, I'm going to bring this back in now, were you dealing with the fact that you were, beginning to start a family?
Yes. In fact, those Misanthrope and Dancing at Lunasa I have but my most vivid memories of them were having to do with the fact that I was 7 months pregnant with Misanthrope, sat there on opening night, and Christopher was kicking a great deal. I didn't know he was Christopher yet, but right. It was like he was excited to be there too. Dancing at Lunasa, he was 10 months old. And during the tech week, when Eric had to be up teaching at Hofstra, our babysitter we would use regularly got sick, and I had to bring him to tech with me. And that's, a very vivid memory of Alan Moyer, the set designer, put him to bed in one of the, dressing rooms. And we took the little baby monitor and put it on the stage manager's table. And, it was a lot of people who had families there at the time. And the fact that I was the artistic director meant that I did not feel self-conscious that I had to do this. It was what it was. And Dancing at Lunasa was a production I was extremely proud of and did incredibly well. It was at the beginning of the time when we were having some difficulties. And so the fact that it did so well at the start of the 93-94 season was a big
It had a lot of single ticket or walk-up ticket sales. People were coming just to see that.
That's right.
Even if they weren't part of the subscription.
That's right.
House.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were also beginning to work on work. You weren't personally directing it, but you were programming work by August Wilson, including Joe Turner's Come and Gone, who brought in the Walter Dallas. It was at that point a local Philadelphia director. He was working at working in Philadelphia. He was the head of the drama program at UArts. He's a well-known person in town. So you brought it, and he knew he'd worked on August Wilson many times. He was one of the,
actually he had not. I don't think he
not
had
by that time.
No, I think his first August Wilson was Joe Turner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He'd worked at the Drama Guild a few times, and I actually went up to Yale to see. He did a show up at Yale Rep, and I went to see that because I'd gotten to know him, and I wanted to get to know his work because I hadn't seen him at the Drama Guild. And we were just incredibly lucky that this phenomenal director lived and worked in Philadelphia. The following year, we brought him in to do Spunk, the Zora Neale Hurston adaptation, and then he did Two Trains Running, and was supposed to do Of Mice and Men, actually, which ended up being our last production. But he was, because of the great productions he did of the two August Wilson plays, Lloyd Richards got sick, and he was invited to do the world premiere of Seven Guitars out in Chicago.
I see.
Which he did.
But he'd also, the theater had received a special grant to support him. You got $1 million. It's at $1 million grant.
That's
from
right.
Lila Atkinson
That's right.
Wallace Foundation.
But he was already directing with us once a year before we got the grant. Honestly, I think a lot of the reason we got the grant was because we had Walter, and the grant enabled us to pay him a salary to be on the artistic staff, as opposed to simply, a sort of an unofficial resident director and, good friend. The other things we did with the grant were, a lot of, community outreach efforts, and hired somebody especially for that, Marcia Pendleton. We were that was a huge, huge thing for us because we had already been making efforts in that direction, and that's what the grant recognized.
Yeah, I noticed from the newspaper articles I've been scanning that from the beginning, you were making very explicit statements saying we need to do more diverse type of work. We need to be employing a broad variety of artists. We want to be involved with other communities besides the communities that the Drama Guild had traditionally been serving. You were looking to expand the repertoire. You were looking to expand the audiences. You were looking to expand the type of material you were working on. Can you talk about your philosophy? That's so much in the news now, but this is an old conversation, is what I meant. Absolutely. This has been in the forefront for a long time.
And it's even older than the 1990s, because all of that was based on, obviously, personal belief, but the experience that I'd had at Hartford Stage. Because Mark Lamos and Bill Stewart, as the managing director, and I really, really worked at Hartford to just make sure that the work was not all white, just to be, to include, African American voices, playwrights, to cast, as I said, colorblind casting, non-traditional casting, as we called it back then, the classic plays. This is a conversation that's been going on for decades. That's, that's very much on the front burner now, as it should be and as it should have been all along. But so I just basically carried that philosophy, which I was very rooted in, into the Drama Guild.
There was an intention to build a relationship with the local Black audience in Philadelphia, and by that time, Philadelphia had within the city itself, I think by that point, had a larger African American population than it did the white population, and was beginning to have a significant Latino population, a significant Asian population. How did that go? How did you were putting distinct efforts into it. What happened?
Well, I mean, it single ticket wise, it was incredibly exciting when we would do an August Wilson play or a Spunk. And by the way, they were incredibly well done by Walter. I mean, they were absolutely the rival of the New York productions, no question. Wendell Pierce played the lead in Joe Turner. I mean, 26 years old, unknown at the time. It was really, those were really superb productions that I was so proud to be associated with. And the single ticket buyers, lots and lots of African-American theater goers came to those. And then the point of the Lila Wallace grant was, can we, turn single ticket buyers into subscribers? That's much harder to do. And every theater around the country, I think, who has made these attempts has found that. That's not in and of itself a bad thing, but it's a challenge. Subscriptions.
Why was that? So by this point, you must have been getting schooled a lot because you were having the subscription rate kept falling. As I read from these articles, each year you would have a drop in the number of regular subscribers. And I'm assuming these were mainly the older subscribers, and mainly white subscribers who were often coming in from the suburbs. Were those the people you were losing?
We never knew. I think it would have been so good if we could have done a survey about, well, who are we losing? Why are we losing them? I mean, before I even mounted a single play, I got a phone message from somebody when I announced the first plays we were doing, which were Midsummer Night's Dream and Bozeman and Lane, and said, you've got to do plays by Miller and Williams from the 30s. And I kind of laughed to myself that they didn't write plays in the 30s. But in fact, I think that's what the audience may have wanted. Was just more. Now I have to say, I think the subscription audience loved the August Wilson plays because they're very accessible. And so I don't think we were losing subscribers for that reason, but we were losing subscribers for the reasons that, we were still doing, new unfamiliar plays, in addition to the Shakespeare always sold really well and got great school groups and so forth. Honestly, Peter, the problem is we never really did find out why we lost subscribers. And it wasn't sometimes because the attrition rate was not so bad after our weakest season, which was the 93-94 season. So go figure. Or maybe it was the 92-93 season, excuse me. Right. So, maybe it was, they didn't want to see the plays that we were about to do. I don't know. Maybe they didn't, we just never really found out.
So nowadays you might have called in a consulting group and they would have done a focus when you would have had all these demographic breakdowns, but that type of data mining wasn't necessarily available back then.
Well, we didn't have the internet back then. A lot of things have been made much, much easier. We had to do everything with phone calls and writing. I guess we started to have the internet in the 90s, but not the way we do now.
No.
No. And in fact, this is maybe skipping ahead a little bit, but I did feel when we had the really precipitous drop after the 93-94 season, which was the strongest season of all, artistically and in terms of single ticket sales, we were kind of going, okay, finally, we're really on track. That was the year that started with Dancing at Luna's. I had Two Trains Running, huge hit, and also Othello, which did very well. And so then 50% of the audience didn't want to come back, and we could not figure it out. And I said to the board, let's do a survey. And if it's because of the work, then I'll step down because I don't, water down the work. I'm trying to do the most populist plays I can really get behind as an artistic director. But what I said was, we're all guessing. We don't know why the subscription rate is so low. So once we find out, then we'll know what to do.
And what did anyone posit at the time? At that point, the Walnut is beginning to increase its subscription rate exponentially. It's attracting a very local audience base in its old, we can sell the fact that this is the city's oldest theater, even though it had been very much architecturally transformed. Right. It would sell its reputation. This is this is real Philadelphia location.
Yeah.
And when I read accounts of what older audience members who are regular subscribers are, they go, what's great there? The parking.
Yeah.
The parking, you can park right next to the theater, just walk over. People who are coming from out, at that point, there wasn't a large number of people living in the city itself. Right. Now there's a lot of people who are empty nesters who are returning, and they're building huge new apartment buildings in Center City, and they move back to Center City, and they can walk just a few blocks to a theater. But then it was always a question of where are you going with your car? Where are you putting your automobile? And the fact that it reassures them so much. You can park right next to the theater and walk right over.
Yeah.
But at the Zellerbach, there is, I think, a parking garage across the street, but you have to cross this busy street to get there. Yeah. There's no real neighborhood there. Did anyone mention things like that? I
mean, yes, we all thought that was a very big part of it. We absolutely did. And I will say the other thing that happened in the final year, which we never did finish, which was the 94-95 year, we finally decided that we were not going to be stuck in the Zellerbach. We were going to do 3 shows in the Zellerbach, which were the right shows, the big shows. And we rented the space at MTI, which I don't remember what that stands for, but it's a converted church, right in the same neighborhood, just around the corner. You could even park in the same place, but it had church pew seating and, maybe 500. So we would do the first, third, and fifth show in the Zellerbach and the second and fourth show at MTI with slightly longer runs to accommodate the subscribers. It is very possible that a number of subscribers went, I don't want to be uprooted like that. I like my seats in the Zellerbach. I've been there for years. It's familiar. Where are you making me go? I don't know where this place is. We never, again, that is a very possible reason, one reason why the subscription rates were low, because they looked at the brochure and they went, wait, they're doing some shows not in the Zellerbach? No, thanks.
And let's return to this question again. You were able to attract Black theater goers on individual rate to come see the shows that appeal to them, but that didn't tend to transfer over into subscriptions.
That's right.
They weren't going to do that.
That's
right.
They
didn't feel like it was something they needed to or wanted to support on a broader basis.
Yes. And I will say one other thing that I'll say, and this is something I've sort of kept to myself, but I am thinking about it. So the final year, the plays we announced were Ain't Misbehavin', the Fats Waller musical. We felt the need, it was, doing a musical would sell tickets. And I thought, okay, it's got to be something I really want to do. That's a small, very interesting, delightful piece.
Fun.
We later on, Walter Dallas was going to direct Of Mice and Men. And then we also did this play by Mustafa Matura, a Caribbean playwright that Surrett Scott was going to direct, called Meetings. So our then board president, in a one-on-one meeting, said to me, I wonder if the subscription rate is low because our subscribers think you're doing too much Black work. And I said, no, absolutely not. And he said, well, Walter is directing Of Mice and Men. And I said, but, he's doing Of Mice and Men. It just, Walter Dallas shouldn't have to just do the African-American slot, right? But 2 of the 5 plays were all African-American casts. At the time, I was sort of appalled that he would even suggest this. And now I think, well, I suppose we shouldn't. He said at the time, there are a lot of prejudiced people out there. And I thought, I was very, very resisting of that as a possibility. But again, we don't know. And even if we'd done the survey, we might not have found that out.
Right.
But
reading, that would be my guess. I mean, again, I wasn't there and I wasn't paying attention to it at the time, what was going on in Philadelphia. Looking back over what I find in the journalistic record, it's hinted at, but I haven't found an article that explicitly addresses that yet. Maybe I just haven't read it the right
No,
thing.
I mean, no, I don't think any article would. Because I don't think people would, if people weren't resubscribing, they might say, I didn't think the plays looked all that interesting or something.
Right.
They would not come out with that.
It was just a club that they didn't feel like they wanted to belong to. Right.
Possibly. But that's interesting that that's something that occurred to you too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I I grew up in America, so I suspected that I know what's there. So I want to go through this quickly because I know it's a big thing in your memory, but it's important. You at some point they told you that they weren't going to renew your contract at that point.
Well, I kind of got wind of it at the board meeting in which I said we needed to do a survey. And that, that we were all guessing, that there were all sorts of possible reasons. So let's find out the actual reason or reasons. And then if the work is the problem, I would step aside. And they all kind of nodded, and then they acted as if I'd already resigned at that meeting. So I saw this coming, and I actually called Zelda Fitch-Handler, whom I knew somewhat, not very well. She had left Arena in 91, and she was then the head of the graduate acting program at NYU. She had and has one of her sons lives in Philly, and she had seen some of the work. and weighed in on the Zellerbach. And she had me fax, because we faxed back then, my artistic statement, several pages and to her. And then we talked. My recollection is we talked most days for about a week, and she was incredibly helpful about how I should conduct myself at these board meetings and not be apologetic, but insist that they do the survey. And it was amazing what she told me. And if I'd heard it a few weeks sooner, I always feel maybe the outcome would have been the same, but I would have felt better about my role in it all. So I was asked to have a one-on-one lunch meeting with the board president. And I kind of went in armed with Zelda's, words ringing in my ears. And he said, "We don't want to renew you." At the end of it, he said, complimentary things about the work, said it's not attracting the subscription numbers we need. And so we have to make a change. And I said, okay, but because we've just come off a strong season, I think this is going to be perceived as, a bad move, very bad timing. And he said, well, you have to say you've resigned. We don't want it to be known that we're firing you. And I refused. And I said, I'm a very bad liar. I don't know what reason we would give. And, I won't badmouth the company. I won't talk about, I won't say things that will endanger the Drama Guild. And he said, well, I don't think the theater will survive unless you say you've resigned. And I said, I can't do that. I'm sorry. I will, do whatever else you need me to do to kind of keep the theater going. I don't want it to go under, but I can't do that. And then they gave me a press release a few days later that said I decided to resign. And I absolutely hit the ceiling. And I felt I was, I had to tell the staff, I had to, it was tough. It was tough. It was tough to walk the tightrope of, let's not blame them. They're doing what they feel they need to do. This is what's happening. We'll get through this. But then when I saw this, I said I wouldn't say this, and you cannot say that I'm voluntarily resigning, because I'm not. So it went out. It would have
been easy for you because you had a young child at that point to say, well, I'm raised my family, but that would have put a different narrative on it. Female artistic director can't handle children and work at the same time.
That was in the back of my mind. And the other thing was, my mother had died. She was very, had an illness that was terminal, and we brought her down to Philly in the fall of '93, right when Dancing at Luna's had closed. She was in a nursing home right near the offices of the Drama Guild. So in the 93-94 season, which happened to be a very strong season artistically, I was also taking care of my mother, not on a daily basis, not physically, but, emotionally and mentally and, all those things. She died in March 94, right when Two Trains Running opened. And a lot of people knew this, that I was dealing with, the recent loss of a parent plus a child who was still less than 2 years old, plus running this theater. And I absolutely resisted saying leaving for personal reasons, because it didn't feel fair to pretend that I couldn't handle it when in fact I felt I was handling it quite well. And I also then subsequently thought, and it wouldn't have been fair to future women who want this kind of job. So unfortunately, I do feel they probably were right, that if I'd played along and said I resigned, maybe they would have made a go of it. I'm not sure, though, because there was no artistic director to raise, they had to start this emergency fundraising campaign, and there's no artistic director or artistic direction to do it with. And then I would be asked, well, what did you feel about this? And I would have to play it very neutral and say, well, it's alarming. We didn't renew our subscribers. So this is what the board felt they needed to do, and not comment on it. But I didn't pretend that it had been my idea. No.
Right. Wow. So where did you leave Philadelphia at that point? Did you go back?
No, we didn't. Not for another year, actually. Oh. It's interesting. Actually, Eric had gotten very fond of Philadelphia, and it was difficult. By the way, I took over of Mice and Men. That was our last project, which was a wonderful, because I didn't want the theater to close. And I thought if I could do a strong production of that was kind of the swan song. And then the theater closed in the winter of 95. No, I directed a play at the Manhattan Theater Club later that winter, spring, and I commuted. It was kind of crazy. And then that same play that I did at Manhattan Theater Club, Sarah Garanzik invited me to do at the Philadelphia Theater Company in the fall of 95. That was 3 viewings by Jeffrey Hatcher. And that was the first play I did at the Philadelphia Theater Company. And then we moved to New York, to Brooklyn. But Sarah brought me back repeatedly to the Philadelphia Theater Company.
Which is, thank you for bringing her name in, because
Yes.
because here's another local female artistic director who had herself been through a near-death experience with her own company. Her company had nearly folded in '89. She'd managed to bring it back. It was then still at Plays and Players, right?
Yes.
So it was still in its original space. It hadn't moved to the larger space yet. But it sounds like she came in to support you and find you things to do in Philadelphia right away, because she was like, "You're available. I'll use you."
Yeah. Well, I think she actually asked me to do. I think she saw 3 viewings in New York and said she wanted to bring it to Philly with me directing. And I at first said no, I'd just done it. But then as it became clear we're going to stay in Philly longer, I thought, well, why not? I can cast it with some local actors, and I loved working on it some more. The playwright came, and that started. Sarah and I knew each other as peers and friends. But that started just a wonderful working and friend relationship for, I think it was more than 20 years that I worked there I did 10 plays over a period of 20 years there.
Right. I have written down just some of them that I was intrigued by you working on. So you started off with Jeffrey Hatcher's 3 viewings, and then you worked on Molly Sweeney, another Brian Friel play, which is similar to 3 viewings in that it's monologues.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I loved Brian Friel. That was a wonderful play to work on. And again, I feel proud of that particular production. Tricky with childcare and so forth.
You also worked on This Is Our Youth in 2001. And what was by that? Were you working with? Was it New York actors or Philadelphia actors?
Yeah. So that particular play, by that time, Zelda Fitzhandler had brought me in to direct several plays in the grad acting program, and that play, of course, is a 3-character play by Kenneth Lonergan. Wonderful play with 3 high school students, and so all 3 actors I used were recent graduates from the program with whom I'd worked in the late '90s. And it was, and so they all knew each other and had a wonderful rapport. That happened to be a play that we just cast with New York actors, but the other plays, most of the plays we did a combination of New York and Philly actors.
Right. And now, so you did, how many productions have you done at PTC?
I counted them and they're 10.
10.
Actually, yeah.
Right. I by that point, I actually met you because I came in as a understudy for Outside Mullingar, and I suddenly got the call, "Can you run this part in a week?"
That's right.
But I was so impressed.
But then I felt it was really important to give you all the support you needed or wanted to do that.
It was amazing for me. I really felt
great.
supported. Those 2 shows that I went on. Of course, and then I'm working with my friend Tony Lawton as my son, which is hysterical because
he's right.
We're not that far apart in age, but that didn't matter in terms of the show. It went well. So overall, now you have such a long perspective on the history of Philadelphia theater. When you look at where Philadelphia is now, as opposed to where Philadelphia was as you were becoming aware of the theater world, Philadelphia in the 1960s and 70s was still very much a tryout town for New York. So there were always big stars coming in, always big productions coming in. And Philadelphia audiences seem to have expected that in terms of their entertainment. And I've heard that mentioned as a reason why there was no large bastion regional theater company in Philadelphia that there was in other large theater cities because of its proximity to New York. Would you feel that's a fair analysis?
I definitely think so. I think Philadelphia audiences saw themselves as, I sometimes felt when I was there that there was some work that was done that was, I thought, as good as, if not better than, the 2 Trains Running and the Joe Turner, right, for starters. As good as the productions I saw in New York, which were also terrific. But I felt that there was sometimes a little bit of because of the proximity to New York, maybe on the part of some people, I don't want to generalize, but a lack of understanding that the homegrown work here, whether it's, actors from Philly, New York, both, a combination, can be just as good as the New York work. Just because it's here doesn't mean it's inferior. I also think that by the time I came along in 1990, there were a lot of very grassroots theaters like People's Light, like Wilma. The Arden was starting out, Philadelphia Theater Company, and as you say, come back, really made this amazing comeback. There were other theaters in the Philadelphia area that were doing really vital, exciting work. And there may have been less of a feel that there is a necessity to have this kind of flagship theater, as opposed to the Arena. You know, when it started out, it was the only game in town for 30 years, 35 years, as opposed to Hartford, where now there's the Hartford Theater Works. But when I was there in the 80s, there was nothing except some college theater and community theater in Hartford. So Philadelphia did have other options. And I think that not, unfortunately, through the Drama Guild, but through these other theaters, I absolutely feel in the decades since I've been gone from, living and working in Philly, the audiences have, grow loyal to a specific theater, a specific company, a specific aesthetic, a specific location. I think that I remember Dan Shea, our managing director, when I first arrived, said, as we looked at these terrible subscription numbers and we hadn't put on a single play, he said, I think the support for the Drama Guild is very widespread, but only a quarter of an inch deep. And I think there was a lot to that. I also think that these other theaters I just mentioned have found in the years since that their audiences are very loyal to them and identify with them and feel a part of a community when they go there. And I think it was hard to create a community at the Zellerbach and the Annenberg. Again, I take some of the blame on that on myself. I feel as if I did a fair amount of things the first couple of years and launched some initiatives. It did, I will just say candidly, it became more difficult when my personal life got so crowded with my mother and our son. I couldn't be out and about as often as I was in the first couple of years. But I think the Philadelphia, and just from what I've seen being at the Philadelphia Theater Company, back there over the period of 20 years, it was very exciting to see the audiences recognize that this is created just for you aspect of the productions done at these various theaters.
Well, that is all such wonderful insight on what's going on in Philadelphia. Let's just wrap off the interview with what happened then in the rest of your life. You moved to Brooklyn. You and your husband are both on the faculty.
I taught for many years at NYU. I ran an undergraduate directing program at NYU. I also have taught. I did that for 18 years, and simultaneously for now 23 years, I've taught in the MFA directing program at Brooklyn College. Sometimes I did direct off Broadway in New York, but not nearly as often as I directed in academic training programs and at the Philadelphia Theater Company.
Right. Well, Mary, thank you so much. This has been more than I could have ever asked for in terms of your openness, your insight, and the information you've been able to share with us. Our listeners are all very grateful for you joining us today and for your generosity of spirit and doing this interview with us. So I'm going to thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to sign off. Okay. And if do you have any people back in Philadelphia you want to give a special shout out to?
Harriet Power and Bob Headley. Definitely. Haven't seen them recently. Some of my favorite people, Barbara Silsley, Sarah Goranzik, Chris Colucci. Love him.
There we go. We all love Chris. All right. Thank you, Mary. I will stop the recording.
Thank you.